Hello everyone and welcome back to The Deep, your favorite channel for horror stories. I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone could leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also, like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Don't forget to check out the first pinned comment for more. Haunted Hitchhiker, Honeymoon Terror. Emily and Daniel had just begun the adventure of their lives. After a beautiful wedding surrounded by friends and family, they set off on a road trip for their honeymoon, eager to explore the countryside and enjoy their first days as a married couple. The joy of their new life together was palpable as they drove along the winding roads, the sun setting behind them, casting a golden glow over the landscape. The couple had always loved the idea of taking the scenic route, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The open road offered a sense of freedom, and they relished the opportunity to explore new places at their own pace. The plan was simple: drive through the countryside, stopping at charming inns along the way, and enjoy the tranquility of each other's company. As the evening wore on, the roads grew quieter, and the warm hues of the sunset faded into the cool blues of dusk. Emily and Daniel chatted about their future, their plans, and the excitement of starting a family one day. The world seemed perfect, and they felt like the luckiest couple in the world. But as they drove deeper into the countryside, the roads became narrower, the trees thicker, and the atmosphere more eerie. A sense of unease began to creep into their conversation, though neither wanted to admit it. The road, once a symbol of their freedom, now seemed to stretch on endlessly, shrouded in the growing darkness. Then, in the distance, they saw her, a lone figure standing by the side of the road, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light. She appeared out of nowhere, her long hair wild and tangled, her clothes tattered. Instinctively, Daniel slowed the car, his heart pounding as he exchanged a concerned glance with Emily. The woman's appearance was unsettling. Her hair, dark and unkempt, hung in tangled waves around her pale face, obscuring her features. She wore a dress that looked out of place, old-fashioned and torn, as if it had been through years of wear and tear. Despite the strangeness of the situation, Emily felt a pang of sympathy. It was a cold night, and the woman appeared to be in distress. Daniel hesitated, his hand hovering over the gearshift. "Do you think we should stop?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. The thought of leaving the woman alone on such a deserted road didn't sit well with him, but something about her presence sent a shiver down his spine. Emily, always compassionate, nodded. "We can't just leave her here. She might need help." Her voice was firm, though she couldn't shake the unease that had settled over her. Daniel pulled the car to a stop a few feet from the woman, and Emily rolled down her window. "Are you okay? Do you need a ride?" she asked gently, trying to sound reassuring despite the chill creeping into her voice. The woman slowly turned her head towards them, her movements deliberate and eerie. When she spoke, her voice was soft, almost a whisper, and carried an unsettling tone. "Thank you. I need to get home. It's not far from here." She gestured vaguely down the road, her hand trembling slightly. Despite the growing discomfort, Emily and Daniel couldn't bring themselves to refuse. The thought of leaving the woman alone in the dark seemed cruel, and so they opened the back door, allowing her to climb inside. As she settled into the back seat, the atmosphere in the car shifted, becoming heavy and oppressive. As they resumed their journey, the car's interior felt colder than before, the warmth that had filled it earlier replaced by an inexplicable chill. The woman sat silently in the back seat, her presence casting a shadow over the previously light-hearted mood. Emily tried to make conversation, hoping to ease the tension, but the woman's responses were brief, almost dismissive. "Where exactly are you headed?" Emily asked, turning slightly in her seat to face their passenger. The woman's eyes were downcast, her face partially hidden by her hair, and she didn't look up when she answered. "There's a small town up ahead," the woman replied, her voice barely audible. "You can drop me off near the cemetery. It's close to my home." The mention of the cemetery sent a chill down Emily's spine, but she forced a smile and nodded. Daniel kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The sense of unease that had been gnawing at him since they picked up the woman was now almost unbearable. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but he didn't want to alarm Emily. The darkness outside the car grew thicker, and the road seemed to stretch on endlessly. The trees lining the road closed in around them, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The car's headlights barely penetrated the gloom, and the air inside the vehicle felt heavy, suffocating. Emily noticed a change in Daniel's demeanor and reached out to touch his arm, offering a reassuring squeeze. "It's okay, we're almost there," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was trying to comfort, Daniel, the woman in the back seat, or herself. As they approached the outskirts of the small town the woman had mentioned, the sense of dread in the car became almost tangible. The buildings were old and decrepit, their windows dark and unwelcoming. The narrow streets were empty, devoid of any sign of life, and the silence was deafening. "We're here," Daniel said, his voice strained. He slowed the car as they neared the cemetery, the iron gates looming ominously in the headlights. The woman remained silent, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. Emily turned to the woman, forcing a smile. "Is this where you want to get out?" she asked, hoping to mask the fear in her voice. The woman didn't respond immediately, and when she finally did, her words sent a chill down Emily's spine. "Yes, this is the place," the woman whispered, her voice distant and hollow. She turned her head slowly to look at Emily, and for the first time, Emily caught a glimpse of her face. Her skin was pale and almost translucent, her eyes dark and sunken, and her expression was one of deep sorrow. Emily's heart raced as she stared into the woman's eyes, a sense of horror washing over her. There was something unnatural about their passenger, something that defied explanation. Before Emily could react, the woman reached for the door handle and stepped out of the car, moving with an unnatural grace. As the woman walked towards the cemetery gates, Emily felt an overwhelming urge to stop her, to call out and ask who she really was. But the words caught in her throat, and she could only watch in stunned silence as the woman disappeared into the darkness. After the woman disappeared into the shadows, Daniel and Emily sat in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over them like a heavy blanket. The air in the car was thick with tension, and neither of them dared to speak, afraid of what they might say. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "We should go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands were shaking as he gripped the steering wheel, and his face was pale. Emily nodded, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of the strange encounter. They drove away from the cemetery in silence, the tension in the car palpable. Emily couldn't shake the image of the woman's haunting eyes, and the coldness of her voice echoed in her mind. She glanced at Daniel, who was visibly shaken, and reached out to touch his arm. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. Daniel didn't respond immediately, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Finally, he nodded, but Emily could see the fear in his eyes. I don't understand what happened," he said, his voice shaky. "She was so strange, and the way she looked at us. I've never seen anything like it." Emily nodded, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that they had encountered something otherworldly, something that defied explanation. As they drove away from the small town, the darkness outside the car seemed to close in around them, suffocating and oppressive. The further they drove from the cemetery, the more Emily and Daniel's unease grew. They couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed paths with something beyond the realm of the living. As they drove through the deserted streets, the car's headlights illuminated an old, run-down inn on the side of the road. Desperate for answers, they decided to stop and ask about the woman they had encountered. The inn's interior was dimly lit, and the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and mildew. An elderly innkeeper greeted them with a weary smile, his eyes filled with a quiet sadness. Emily and Daniel hesitated before explaining their encounter with the mysterious woman, hoping the innkeeper might have some answers. As they described the woman's appearance and her request to be dropped off near the cemetery, the innkeeper's face paled. He listened intently, his expression growing more somber with each passing word. When they finished, he let out a heavy sigh and shook his head. "You're not the first to encounter her," the innkeeper said, his voice low and filled with sorrow. "She was once a young woman who lived in this town. She died tragically many years ago, her life cut short by a terrible accident. Since then, Her spirit has been trapped, unable to find peace. She appears to travelers on this road, asking for a ride home, but her home no longer exists. Emily and Daniel exchanged horrified glances, the realization of what they had experienced sinking in. The woman they had picked up was not of this world. She was a restless spirit, forever bound to the road near the cemetery. The innkeeper's words confirmed their deepest fears, and they felt a cold wave of dread wash over them. The innkeeper's final words echoed in their minds as they left the inn and returned to their car. "You did the right thing by helping her," he said. "But remember, not all spirits are as harmless as she is. Some are filled with anger, and if you cross their path, you may not be as fortunate." As they drove away, the weight of their encounter lingered, a chilling reminder that the world they knew was not as safe as they once believed. The haunting image of the woman's sorrowful eyes would stay with them forever, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the edges of their reality. Viking Feast. João and Miguel, two friends from Portugal, had long dreamed of exploring the rugged landscapes of Norway. The country's majestic fjords, towering mountains, and deep forests beckoned them with the promise of adventure. They rented a car and embarked on a road trip that would take them through some of the most remote and beautiful parts of the country. The journey had been breathtaking, with endless scenic views and the thrill of discovering small, picturesque villages tucked away in the valleys. As the days passed, they found themselves drawn deeper into the heart of the Norwegian wilderness, eager to experience the country's untamed beauty. One afternoon, as they were driving through a particularly remote area, they noticed a sign for a village that wasn't on their map. The sign was old and weathered, the letters barely visible, but it piqued their curiosity. Intrigued by the prospect of discovering a hidden gem, they decided to take the detour. The narrow road led them through dense forests and over steep hills, the trees closing in around them as they ventured further from the main route. The air grew colder, and a sense of isolation began to settle over them. But the excitement of exploring a village untouched by modern tourism kept them going. As they approached the village, they noticed something strange. The buildings were ancient, constructed from dark, weathered wood, and the streets were empty. There was an eerie stillness in the air, and the village looked as if it had been frozen in time. As they slowly drove through the village, João and Miguel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The silence was unnerving, and the old, Viking-style buildings looked like they belonged to another era. Just as they were about to turn back, they spotted two figures standing by the side of the road. A man and a woman, dressed in traditional Viking attire, were waving at them, signaling for them to stop. João and Miguel exchanged puzzled glances, wondering if the couple was part of some historical reenactment or local tradition. Despite the strangeness of the situation, their curiosity got the better of them, and they decided to pull over. The couple approached the car with smiles on their faces. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with long, unkempt hair and a thick beard. The woman was striking, with flowing blonde hair and piercing blue eyes. Their clothes, made of coarse wool and leather, were intricately detailed with Norse symbols. "Greetings, travelers," the man said in a deep, accented voice. "We are on our way to a feast in the Great Hall. Would you be kind enough to give us a ride?" João and Miguel were taken aback by the request. The couple's appearance and mannerisms seemed so authentic, it was as if they had stepped out of another century. Though they were hesitant, they couldn't resist the opportunity to learn more about this mysterious village and its people. After a brief exchange, they agreed to give the couple a ride. As they continued down the winding road, João and Miguel struck up a conversation with the couple. The man introduced himself as Sigurd, and the woman as Ingrid. They spoke of the village as if it were a living, breathing entity, filled with ancient customs and traditions passed down through generations. Sigurd explained that the village had remained isolated from the rest of the world for centuries, its people living in harmony with the land and following the old ways. He spoke of their deep respect for the Norse gods and the rituals they performed to honor them. The more João and Miguel listened, the more fascinated they became. Ingrid, with her soft, melodic voice, recounted tales of Viking warriors, battles fought, and victories won. She spoke of grand feasts held in the Great Hall, where the villagers would come together to celebrate their triumphs and pay homage to their ancestors. Her stories were so vivid and captivating that Joao and Miguel felt as though they had been transported back in time. As they drove, the landscape around them grew more foreboding. The trees seemed to close in on the road, their gnarled branches casting long, twisted shadows. The sky darkened, and a heavy fog began to roll in, obscuring their view of the surrounding countryside. Despite the growing sense of unease, Joao and Miguel were enthralled by the couple's stories. They couldn't help but be drawn in by the allure of the village's rich history and the promise of experiencing a true Viking feast. When Sigurd and Ingrid invited them to join the celebration at the Great Hall, they eagerly accepted, eager to be part of something so unique. As the car approached the village's outskirts, the fog thickened, and the road became almost impassable. The trees loomed like sentinels, and the temperature dropped noticeably. Joao and Miguel exchanged uneasy glances, but Sigurd and Ingrid reassured them that they were close to their destination. When the car finally emerged from the forest, Joao and Miguel were greeted by a sight that took their breath away. The Great Hall stood before them, an imposing structure built from massive wooden beams, its roof adorned with carvings of dragons and wolves. The building exuded an air of ancient power, and the light from within flickered warmly through the windows. Sigurd directed them to park near the entrance, and as they stepped out of the car, Joao and Miguel were struck by the silence that surrounded them. The air was thick with anticipation, and the only sound was the crackling of torches lining the path to the hall. Ingrid led the way, her movements graceful and fluid. As they approached the entrance, Joao and Miguel noticed that the doors were carved with intricate scenes depicting Viking warriors in battle, their expressions fierce and determined. The craftsmanship was astounding, and they couldn't help but marvel at the detail. Once inside, the Great Hall was even more impressive. The interior was vast, with long tables stretching the length of the room, covered in platters of food and goblets of mead. The air was filled with the rich aroma of roasting meat, and the walls were adorned with shields, swords, and banners. A large fire roared in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the scene. Sigurd and Ingrid guided Joao and Miguel to a place of honor at the head of one of the tables. As they sat down, the villagers, dressed in similar Viking attire, began to gather around, their faces obscured by the flickering firelight. The atmosphere was charged with excitement, and Joao and Miguel couldn't help but feel a sense of privilege at being included in such a grand celebration. The feast commenced with a booming cheer from the villagers, their voices echoing through the hall. Goblets were raised, and toasts were made in honor of the gods and the ancestors. The villagers began to sing Old Norse songs, their voices deep and resonant, filling the room with a sense of camaraderie and ancient tradition. Joao and Miguel were quickly served platters of food and goblets of mead. The dishes were unlike anything they had ever tasted, rich, savory meats, hearty stews, and freshly baked bread. The mead was sweet and intoxicating, its warmth spreading through their bodies, easing their earlier discomfort. As they ate, Sigurd regaled them with tales of heroic deeds and legendary battles. Ingrid joined in, her voice weaving through the stories like a thread, adding depth and emotion to the narrative. Joao and Miguel listened, captivated by the couple's storytelling, feeling as though they were part of the history they described. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere in the hall grew more intense. The villagers' singing became louder, their movements more animated. The fire in the hearth blazed brighter, casting long shadows on the walls. Joao and Miguel began to feel a sense of unease, their earlier excitement giving way to a growing fear. Ingrid noticed their discomfort and smiled reassuringly. "Do not worry, friends. You are our honored guests. Tonight, you will experience the true spirit of our village, a night you will never forget." Her words, though meant to comfort, only heightened their anxiety. There was something in her eyes, a glint of something dark and unsettling, that made Joao and Miguel question their decision to stay. But it was too late to leave, the villagers had surrounded them, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. As the night deepened, the villagers began to chant, their voices low and rhythmic, filling the hall with an ominous energy. The air grew thick with tension, and Joao and Miguel felt a growing sense of dread. The warmth of the fire no longer provided comfort. Instead, it seemed to stoke the fear building within them. Sigurd and Ingrid stood, raising their goblets high. The villagers fell silent, their eyes fixed on the couple. "Tonight," Sigurd proclaimed, his voice booming through the hall, "we honor the old ways. We pay tribute to the gods with a feast worthy of their favor. And tonight, we welcome our honored guests to join us in this sacred ritual." A sense of foreboding settled over João and Miguel as they exchanged worried glances. The atmosphere in the hall had shifted, the villagers' once welcoming demeanor now replaced by something more sinister. The realization began to dawn on them that they were not here as guests, but as something else entirely. Ingrid's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than before. "Come," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "It is time for the final course. You have been chosen to partake in the most sacred of feasts." Panic surged through João and Miguel as the villagers closed in around them, their expressions hungry and predatory. The truth hit them like a hammer. They were not here to enjoy the feast, they were the feast. The villagers had lured them into the great hall with the promise of hospitality, only to reveal their true intentions at the last moment. Desperation took hold as João and Miguel tried to escape, but the villagers were too many, too strong. Sigurd and Ingrid's laughter echoed in their ears as they were dragged towards the center of the hall, the fire blazing brighter than ever, casting their twisted shadows on the walls. The chanting grew louder, more frenzied, as the villagers prepared for the final act of their gruesome ritual. As João and Miguel realized the full horror of their situation, their screams were swallowed by the roaring flames and the deafening chants of the villagers. The night that had begun with excitement and adventure ended in terror and despair, the shadows of the great hall bearing witness to their final, horrifying fate. Time Warp Terror, Haunted Hitchhiker. A group of friends from Toronto, Rachel, Peter, Laura, and Marcus, had planned a road trip to the United States for a long weekend. Their destination was a charming small town just across the border, where they intended to relax and explore the local sights. The journey was filled with excitement as they drove through the scenic countryside, with Niagara Falls as their halfway point. The trip was going smoothly until they reached Niagara Falls. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the cascading waters. As they slowed down to admire the view, they noticed a lone figure standing by the side of the road. It was a woman, dressed in clothing from another era, a long, flowing dress and a bonnet, reminiscent of the early 1900s. Intrigued and somewhat concerned, Rachel suggested they stop to see if the woman needed help. The others agreed, curious about her strange appearance. As they pulled over, the woman turned to face them, revealing a pale, expressionless face. Her eyes were distant, as if she were lost in time. Peter rolled down the window and asked if she needed a ride. The woman nodded slowly, her movements almost mechanical. She spoke in a soft, archaic accent, explaining that she needed to cross the border into the United States. The friends exchanged uneasy glances but decided to offer her a ride, thinking she might be part of some historical reenactment. As the woman climbed into the back seat, the atmosphere in the car changed. The once light-hearted mood grew tense, and an unspoken sense of dread filled the air. The group continued their journey, unaware that their decision to help this mysterious passenger would lead them into a nightmare beyond their imagination. As they approached the border, the sky darkened rapidly, and the air grew heavy with an ominous stillness. The usual bustle at the border crossing was strangely absent, the guards nowhere to be seen. The only sound was the rhythmic hum of the car's engine as it idled at the checkpoint. The woman in the back seat remained silent, her gaze fixed straight ahead. Rachel felt a shiver run down her spine as she noticed the temperature inside the car dropping. Laura, who was seated next to the woman, tried to make conversation, but the passengers' responses were short and devoid of emotion. When they finally drove up to the booth, a border officer appeared, but something was off. His uniform was old-fashioned, and his demeanor was unsettling. He asked for their passports in a monotone voice, barely making eye contact. As he inspected the documents, he glanced at the woman in the back seat, his expression briefly darkening. Without further delay, he handed back the passports and waved them through. As they crossed the border, the landscape around them seemed to shift. The familiar sights of the modern world faded away, replaced by a barren, desolate wasteland. The road ahead stretched into a dark, endless void, and the car's headlights barely penetrated the thick fog that now enveloped them. Panic set in as the friends realized they were no longer in the world they knew. The woman in the back seat remained eerily calm, her presence growing more unsettling by the minute. Rachel, gripping the steering wheel tightly, tried to stay composed, but the sense of dread was overwhelming. They had crossed not just a physical border, but into another dimension, one filled with unspeakable horrors. The further they drove into the fog, the more distorted the world around them became. The trees along the road twisted into grotesque shapes, their branches clawing at the car as it passed. The sky above was a swirling mass of dark clouds, occasionally illuminated by flashes of crimson lightning. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the sounds of distant, inhuman wails filled their ears. The friends' fear grew with each passing moment. The woman in the back seat remained silent, her presence now suffocating. It was as if she was drawing energy from their terror, feeding on their despair. Rachel glanced at the rearview mirror and gasped in horror. Where the woman had once been, a shadowy, demonic figure now sat, its eyes glowing with malevolent intent. Before they could react, the car suddenly stopped, the engine dying with a sputter. They were stranded in the middle of the desolate landscape, the fog closing in around them like a living entity. The woman, or whatever she had become, finally spoke, her voice now a guttural growl. "You have entered my domain," she hissed, her once soft voice now filled with malice. "To leave, you must find the key. But beware, the challenges ahead will test your very souls." With that, she vanished, leaving the friends alone in the demonic dimension. The car, now useless, was abandoned as they were forced to continue on foot. The ground beneath their feet was uneven and treacherous, and every step felt as though it was drawing them deeper into the abyss. Fear gripped them as they realized they had no choice but to face whatever lay ahead. The only way out was to find the key the demon had spoken of. But what trials awaited them in this twisted, nightmarish world? And would they all survive to see the other side? As they ventured deeper into the dimension, the landscape grew more nightmarish. The ground beneath them pulsed with an unnatural energy, and the twisted trees seemed to watch their every move. The friends were on edge, their senses heightened as they navigated the treacherous terrain. The first trial appeared suddenly, a chasm that stretched across their path, too wide to jump and too deep to see the bottom. The air around it crackled with a dark energy, and the sound of tortured screams echoed from within its depths. There was no way around it, and no way back. A narrow, rickety bridge extended across the chasm, but it looked as though it could collapse at any moment. With no other option, they cautiously began to cross, one by one. The bridge creaked ominously under their weight, swaying precariously with each step. Halfway across, the howling winds intensified, threatening to throw them into the abyss. Laura was the first to lose her footing, slipping on the rotting wood. Marcus, who was closest to her, grabbed her arm just in time, pulling her back to safety. The near-death experience left them all shaken, but they managed to make it across the bridge, their hearts pounding in their chests. Once on the other side, they barely had time to catch their breath before the second trial began. The ground beneath them shifted, revealing a labyrinth of dark tunnels that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The walls were lined with ancient, sinister carvings, and the air was filled with the stench of rot. The tunnels twisted and turned, and the friends quickly found themselves disoriented. The oppressive darkness made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, and every sound seemed amplified, echoing footsteps, distant growls, and the unsettling whisper of unseen entities. They knew they were not alone in the labyrinth, and the key could be hidden anywhere. As they navigated the labyrinth, the sense of dread grew stronger. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the whispers became more distinct, as if they were coming from right behind them. The friends moved cautiously, their eyes darting in every direction, but the darkness made it impossible to tell where they were headed. The further they went, the more they began to see things, visions of their worst fears and darkest memories playing out before them. Rachel saw herself standing alone in an endless void, while Peter was confronted with a monstrous version of himself. Laura's vision was of her loved ones being torn apart by unseen forces, and Marcus saw a future where they were all lost forever in this demonic dimension. Each of them was haunted by these visions, but they couldn't afford to stop. They had to find the key and escape before they lost themselves completely. The labyrinth was playing tricks on their minds, trying to break them down, but they held on to the hope that they could make it out alive. Finally, they reached the heart of the labyrinth, a vast chamber with a single pedestal in the center. On the pedestal lay an ancient, rusted key, glowing with a faint, eerie light. The air in the chamber was thick with malevolent energy, and the friends could feel the presence of the demon watching them from the shadows. Rachel reached for the key, but as soon as she touched it, the ground began to shake violently. The walls of the chamber cracked and crumbled, and the darkness within them began to take shape, forming into grotesque, shadowy figures. The friends were surrounded, and the only way out was to use the key. In a moment of clarity, Marcus grabbed the key from Rachel and thrust it into a lock that had appeared on the pedestal. The shadows recoiled, screaming in agony as a blinding light filled the chamber. The ground beneath them gave way, and they were plunged into the abyss. The blinding light faded, and the friends found themselves back in the car, the engine purring softly as if nothing had happened. The road ahead was clear, the fog lifting to reveal the familiar landscape of the real world. They were back on the road, driving towards their original destination. For a moment, there was stunned silence as they processed what had just occurred. The demonic dimension, the trials, the key, it all felt like a distant nightmare, but the terror was still fresh in their minds. They had survived, but the experience had left them shaken to their core. As they approached the next town, they began to discuss what they had been through. Each of them recounted the visions they had seen in the labyrinth, the horrors they had faced, and the overwhelming fear that had gripped them. But there was one thing they all agreed on: the woman they had picked up was no ordinary hitchhiker. When they reached the border crossing to enter the United States, the officers were back to normal, the checkpoint operating as expected. They were waved through without issue, but something felt off. The woman had vanished, and there was no sign of her in the car. It was as if she had never existed. As they drove away, the friends couldn't shake the feeling that they had left something behind in the demonic dimension. They had escaped, but at what cost? The key had granted them their freedom, but it had also unlocked something dark and sinister within them. The further they drove, the more they realized that the terror they had faced in the other dimension wasn't over. The shadows of that world lingered, haunting their thoughts and dreams. The woman in the old-fashioned clothing had given them a ride into a nightmare, and though they had escaped with their lives, they would never truly be free from the horrors they had witnessed. Cursed Clown, Wax Museum Horror. It was a cool autumn evening in a bustling neighborhood of Chicago. The streets were lined with brownstones, their windows glowing warmly against the crisp night air. James, his wife Sarah, and their 8-year-old daughter Emily were driving home from a friend's birthday party. The night had been filled with laughter, cake, and games, and Emily was still buzzing with excitement in the back seat. As they turned down a quiet street on the way home, they saw something unusual in the middle of the road. Standing under the flickering light of a street lamp was a figure dressed as a clown. His costume was old-fashioned, bright colors with frayed edges, and his face was painted with a wide, unsettling smile. The clown was waving at them, his expression almost desperate. "Is he real?" Emily asked, pressing her face against the window to get a better look. The sight of a clown in the middle of the street was strange, but in a city like Chicago, strange things were almost expected. James slowed the car, unsure of what to do. The clown approached, and they could see him more clearly now. His eyes were wide, almost pleading, and there was something unnervingly off about his appearance. "Maybe he needs help," Sarah suggested, though there was a hint of uncertainty in her voice. James rolled down the window, and the clown stepped closer. "I'm lost," the clown said, his voice surprisingly soft and trembling. "I'm new to the city and got separated from the circus. Can you help me get back? I don't know where I am." Despite the strangeness of the situation, they felt a pang of sympathy for him. After all, he was just a lost performer, and it was late. They decided to help, unaware of the nightmare that awaited them. As As James turned the car around to take the clown back to the circus, a heavy silence settled over the family. The cheerful chatter from earlier had vanished, replaced by an uneasy tension. The clown sat in the passenger seat next to James, his painted face fixed in an unnatural grin. In the back seat, Emily clung to her mother, her earlier excitement now replaced with a sense of dread. The clown gave directions, guiding them through a maze of streets that grew increasingly unfamiliar. The buildings became older, more decrepit, and the glow of the city lights dimmed as they drove deeper into the outskirts. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading into a part of the city best left alone. "Are you sure this is the right way?" James asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The clown nodded, his smile never wavering, but something in his eyes seemed darker, more sinister. "Yes, just a little further." "We're almost there," he replied, his voice carrying a hint of something James couldn't quite place, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Finally, they arrived at a dilapidated lot on the edge of the city. The once vibrant colors of the circus tents were now faded and torn, swaying gently in the breeze. The whole place looked abandoned, as though it had been forgotten by time. But the clown insisted this was the place, urging them to park and follow him inside. Reluctantly, they agreed. Emily, sensing her parents' unease, held tightly to her mother's hand as they exited the car. The clown led them towards the largest tent, his steps quick and purposeful. James exchanged a worried glance with Sarah, but it was too late to turn back. The entrance to the tent loomed before them, dark and foreboding, like the gaping maw of a beast waiting to swallow them whole. Inside the tent, the air was thick with the scent of old fabric and something else, something sweet and sickly, like decaying flowers. The dim lighting cast eerie shadows across the room, making the space feel smaller, more claustrophobic. As they followed the clown deeper into the tent, they began to notice the figures that lined the walls. At first, they seemed to be mannequins, dressed in elaborate costumes from various eras. But as they moved closer, the uncanny realism of the figures became apparent. Their eyes seemed to follow them, their expressions frozen in lifelike detail. There was something deeply unsettling about them, almost as if they were more than just figures made of wax. Emily clung to her mother's side, her small voice trembling as she asked, "Mommy, why do they look so real?" Sarah didn't have an answer. She was too focused on the growing sense of horror that gnawed at her insides. James, too, was beginning to realize that something was terribly wrong. The figures were too detailed, too lifelike, in their expressions. They seemed frozen in terror. The clown led them to a large platform in the center of the tent, where an imposing figure stood, clearly the ringmaster of this eerie circus. But unlike the others, this figure seemed to be the most realistic of all, with a commanding presence that sent chills down their spines. The clown turned to them, his painted smile now seeming grotesque in the dim light. "This is the heart of our circus," he said, his voice taking on a darker, more menacing tone. "A place where the past lives on, preserved for all eternity." As he spoke, the figures around them seemed to close in, their frozen faces contorted in silent screams. James stepped back, pulling Sarah and Emily with him, but the clown blocked their path. The realization hit them all at once: the figures weren't mannequins or wax statues. They were people, once alive, now encased in a thick layer of wax, turned into eternal prisoners of the circus. Panic surged through James as he realized the full extent of the horror they were trapped in. He grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her towards the exit, but the clown was quicker. With an unnatural speed, he moved to block their escape, his smile widening into a macabre grin. "You can't leave now," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "You're part of the show." Emily began to cry, clinging to her mother as the clown reached out towards James. Sarah tried to shield her daughter, but the clown's strength was overwhelming. He grabbed James by the arm, dragging him towards the platform with a force that seemed impossible for his thin frame. "You'll make a perfect addition," the clown sneered, his eyes gleaming with sadistic glee. James struggled against the clown's grip, but it was no use. The platform began to move, revealing a large vat of boiling wax beneath it. The sickly sweet smell grew stronger as the wax bubbled and hissed, the heat rising in waves. Sarah screamed, pulling Emily close as they watched in horror. The clown forced James towards the edge of the vat, his strength relentless. "Please, no!" James pleaded, his voice shaking with fear. But the clown was deaf to his cries. With a final, terrifying smile, he pushed James into the vat. The wax enveloped him, muffling his screams as it solidified around his body. Within moments, he was frozen in place, his face locked in a final expression of agony. Sarah and Emily could only watch in helpless terror as the clown turned his attention to them. "You see," he said, his voice filled with twisted pride, "we preserve the best for last." He reached for Sarah, but she managed to pull Emily away just in time. They ran towards the exit, the shadows of the wax figures looming over them as they fled. The tent seemed to stretch endlessly as Sarah and Emily ran, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. Every corner they turned only revealed more wax figures, their frozen faces twisted in terror. The walls of the tent seemed to close in around them, and the air grew thick with the scent of wax and decay. Behind them, the clown's laughter echoed through the tent, a sound that sent chills down their spines. "You can't escape," he taunted, his voice carrying through the darkness. "You're part of the show now." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she pulled Emily along, desperate to find a way out. But the tent was a maze, and every path seemed to lead them deeper into the nightmare. The exit felt impossibly far away, and the clown's voice grew louder, closer, with every passing moment. Just when they thought all hope was lost, Sarah spotted a sliver of light up ahead. It was the exit, a narrow opening at the far end of the tent. With a surge of adrenaline, she pushed forward, urging Emily to run faster. They could hear the clown's footsteps behind them, heavy and determined, but they didn't dare look back. They burst through the exit, the cold night air hitting them like a shock. But their relief was short-lived. The circus grounds were vast and empty, the tents towering ominously around them. In the distance, they saw the faint glow of a railway crossing, the red lights blinking in the darkness. It was their only hope of escape. Sarah scooped Emily into her arms and ran towards the railway, her lungs burning with every breath. The sound of the train grew louder as they neared the tracks, the rumble of the engine vibrating through the ground. But so did the clown's laughter, a terrifying reminder that they were not safe yet. As Sarah reached the railway crossing, the train's horn blared, signaling its approach. She stumbled onto the tracks, Emily clutched tightly in her arms, as the red lights flashed urgently. The ground beneath them trembled with the force of the oncoming train, but there was no time to wait for it to pass. The clown was right behind them, his footsteps pounding against the ground. Desperate, Sarah looked around for a place to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The railway tracks stretched out into the darkness, and the only cover was the shadows of the nearby trees. She turned to see the clown emerging from the darkness, his smile twisted with malevolence. "You can't escape," he hissed, stepping closer. "This is your final act." But before he could take another step, the train's headlights illuminated the scene, blinding them with its brightness. The rumble of the engine grew deafening as it barreled down the tracks. Sarah held Emily close, shielding her from the terrifying sight. The clown hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he realized the danger. But it was too late. The train was almost upon them, and there was no time to escape. With a final, desperate scream, the clown lunged at Sarah, but the train's impact caught him mid-leap, throwing him back with a sickening crunch. The force of the collision sent the clown flying into the darkness, his body disappearing beneath the wheels of the train. Sarah and Emily collapsed onto the tracks, the weight of their terror finally crashing down on them. The train roared past, its blaring horn drowning out the sounds of the night. When the train finally passed, Sarah looked around, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The clown was gone, and the circus tents were nowhere in sight. It was as if the nightmare had never happened. But the memory of what they had seen, the wax figures, the boiling vat, and the clown's twisted grin, would haunt them forever. Sarah held Emily tightly as they stumbled away from the tracks, their bodies bruised and battered, but alive. They had escaped the horror of the circus, but they knew they would never truly be free of the terror they had endured. the scars would remain, a chilling reminder of the night they came face to face with pure evil. Ghostly ride, the cursed driver. Isabel had never imagined her European backpacking trip would end in such a predicament. Stranded on the outskirts of a small town in rural France, she realized too late that she had miscalculated her expenses and was now completely out of money. Her plan to take a bus back to her friend's apartment in Lyon had fallen apart, leaving her with no choice but to hitchhike. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the quiet road as she walked to the nearest highway. Isabel felt a growing sense of unease, but she knew she had no other option. With her thumb out and her heart racing, she watched the few passing cars, hoping one would stop and offer her a ride. After what felt like an eternity, a silver 1992 Opel Diplomat 4.1 pulled up beside her. The car's sleek, polished exterior was unusual, almost too pristine for its age. The driver, a man in a denim jacket and cap, looked at her through the rearview mirror. His face was expressionless, and he made no move to speak. Isabel hesitated, her instincts warning her to be cautious. But the fading light and the growing chill in the air made her decision for her. She quickly opened the back door and slid into the seat, clutching her backpack tightly. "Thank you," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm headed to Lyon, if that's okay." The man gave a slow, deliberate nod, his eyes never leaving the road. Isabel tried to relax, telling herself that it was just a ride, nothing more. But as the car pulled away and the countryside began to blur past the windows, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The car moved smoothly along the winding roads, the engine purring softly. Isabel couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as she sat in the back seat, watching the driver's unmoving profile. The man hadn't spoken a single word since she got in, not even a casual greeting. His silence was unnerving, but Isabel tried to break the tension with small talk. "So, do you live around here?" she asked, her voice betraying her nervousness. The man didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Isabel swallowed hard and tried again, asking about the sights they were passing, the weather, anything to fill the oppressive silence. But each attempt was met with the same lack of response. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing around the car's interior. It was immaculate, almost too perfect for a vehicle of its age. There were no personal items, no signs of wear, nothing to suggest that it was regularly used. Isabel's unease grew with each passing mile. As the road stretched on, the landscape outside the window began to change. The once picturesque countryside became more desolate, with twisted trees and overgrown fields lining the road. The air inside the car grew colder, and Isabel found herself shivering, despite the warmth of her jacket. Desperate to break the tension, she leaned forward slightly. "Are you sure this is the right way to Lyon?" she asked, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. The man's only response was a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Isabel's heart pounded in her chest as she realized she was completely at the mercy of this stranger, with no idea where he was taking her. After what felt like hours, the car finally pulled into a small, dimly lit town. The streets were deserted, and the buildings looked as though they had been abandoned for years. Isabel's anxiety peaked as the driver steered the car down a narrow, cobblestone street, the tires crunching over the uneven surface. As they approached the town square, the car came to a stop in front of an old, crumbling church. The driver turned off the engine and sat still, his hands resting on the steering wheel. Isabel's pulse raced as she realized this wasn't Lyon, this was somewhere far from where she needed to be. "Is this the right place?" Isabel asked, her voice trembling. The driver didn't respond, his silence more deafening than ever. He simply turned his head slowly to look at her, his eyes empty and cold. In that moment, a terrible realization washed over her. The man in the driver's seat wasn't alive. He was something else entirely, something that didn't belong in this world. Isabel's breath caught in her throat as the memories flooded back, stories she had heard from locals about a fatal accident years ago, where a man driving an Opel Diplomat had died in this very town. The legend said that his spirit was trapped, doomed to wander the roads, searching for lost souls to join him in his eternal torment. Panic set in as Isabel scrambled to open the door, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She stumbled out of the car, her legs weak beneath her. As she turned to run, the man in the denim jacket simply watched her, his gaze following her every move. Isabel's heart pounded as she fled down the darkened streets, desperate to escape the nightmare she had unwittingly entered. Isabel's mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion as she made her way back home, somehow finding a bus that took her part of the way. When she finally reached her apartment in Lyon, the familiar surroundings did little to calm her nerves. She couldn't stop thinking about the man, the ghost, who had driven her to that eerie town. The experience had left her shaken to the core. She tried to settle back into her routine, but the events of that night haunted her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the driver's emotionless face, felt the cold air inside the car, and heard the silence that had filled the journey. Sleep became elusive, and when she did manage to doze off, her dreams were plagued by nightmarish visions of the man in the denim jacket. Strange things began happening around her apartment. It started with small, inexplicable occurrences, a cold draft in the middle of the night, the sound of footsteps echoing through the empty rooms, and lights flickering without reason. Isabel tried to dismiss these as her mind playing tricks on her, but deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. One evening, as she sat in her living room trying to distract herself with a book, she heard a faint tapping at the window. She glanced over, expecting to see a tree branch swaying in the wind, but her blood ran cold when she saw the reflection of a familiar figure standing behind her. She whipped around, but the room was empty. Her heart raced, and she could feel the presence of something malevolent in the air. The haunting grew more intense with each passing day. Isabel found herself waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the sensation of being watched. Objects in her home began to move on their own, and she could hear the distant hum of a car engine, even though no car was near. The realization hit her with chilling clarity: the spirit of the driver had followed her home, and he wasn't going to leave until she set him free. Isabel knew she couldn't live with this haunting presence any longer. Her life had become a waking nightmare, with every corner of her apartment filled with the oppressive energy of the spirit. She had to find a way to end this torment and send the ghost back to where he belonged. But how? She began researching the history of the town where she had been taken that fateful night, uncovering old newspaper articles and local legends. The story of the driver, who had died in a tragic accident on a deserted road, was well known among the townsfolk. They spoke of him with fear and reverence, claiming that his restless spirit haunted the area, luring unsuspecting travelers to their doom. Isabel found an old journal entry from a town elder that mentioned a ritual to release trapped souls. The ritual involved returning to the place of the spirit's death and performing a specific ceremony to guide the soul to the afterlife. It was a long shot, but it was her only hope. She gathered the materials she needed: candles, incense, and a small, ancient book that detailed the ritual's steps. The next day, she made the journey back to the town, her heart heavy with fear and determination. The drive felt endless, each mile taking her closer to the place she had vowed never to return. But she knew this was the only way to rid herself of the spirit that had invaded her life. As she approached the town, the sky darkened, and the air grew thick with tension. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the trees lining the path twisting into ominous shapes. Isabel's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, but she pressed on, determined to finish what she had started. She finally reached the site of the accident, a narrow, winding road just outside the town. The area was eerily quiet, the only sound being the rustling of leaves in the wind. Isabel parked the car and stepped out, her heart pounding in her chest. She set up the ritual, lighting the candles and incense, and began to recite the words from the ancient book. The air around her seemed to thrum with energy as the ritual took hold. As Isabel chanted the ancient words, the air around her grew colder, and the wind began to howl through the trees. The flames of the candles flickered violently, threatening to go out. She could feel the presence of the spirit, the oppressive weight of his gaze pressing down on her. But she didn't falter, she knew she had to complete the ritual. The ground beneath her feet trembled as she reached the final verses of the chant. The wind whipped around her, carrying with it a low, mournful wail that seemed to echo from the very depths of the earth. Isabel's voice grew stronger, fueled by the desperation to free herself from this nightmare. She called out to the spirit, urging him to move on, to leave this world behind and find peace in the afterlife. As she spoke the final words, the wind suddenly stopped, and a heavy silence fell over the area. The candle's flames stood tall and steady, casting an eerie glow over the scene. For a moment, everything was still, and Isabel dared to hope that the ritual had worked. But then, from the darkness, the figure of the driver appeared. His form was hazy, translucent, and his eyes held a sorrowful expression. He stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. Isabel's heart pounded in her chest as he approached, unsure of what he would do. But as he reached the edge of the ritual circle, he stopped and looked at her with an expression of gratitude. "I'm sorry," the spirit's voice whispered on the wind, carrying with it a deep sadness. Isabel felt a tear slip down her cheek as she realized that the man had been trapped in his torment for so long, unable to find peace. She nodded, understanding his pain, and watched as he slowly began to fade away, his form dissolving into the night. As the spirit disappeared, the candle's flames flickered out, leaving Isabel standing alone in the darkness. The oppressive weight that had haunted her for weeks lifted, replaced by a sense of calm. The ritual had worked, the spirit was finally free, and so was she. Isabel took a deep breath, feeling the tension drain from her body. She had faced her deepest fears and emerged victorious, but the experience had changed her forever. As she made her way back to her car, she knew that she would never forget the night she encountered the ghost of the driver and the terror that had consumed her. But she had survived, and with that came a renewed sense of strength and resilience. Haunted Hitchhiker, Night of Terror. In the remote mountains of Romania, the roads are winding, narrow, and often deserted. The region is steeped in ancient folklore, and locals often speak in hushed tones about the spirits that roam the dark forests. It was on one such road that Lena, a young woman traveling alone, found herself late one cold, foggy evening. She had been visiting a friend in Brasov and was now on her way back to Bucharest, but she had taken a wrong turn and was hopelessly lost. The GPS signal had cut out hours ago, leaving her to navigate the treacherous mountain roads with nothing but a paper map and her instincts. As the fog thickened, reducing visibility to mere feet in front of her, Lena's anxiety grew. The twisting roads seemed to stretch on forever, with no signs of civilization in sight. The only sounds were the hum of her car engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. After what felt like an eternity, Lena spotted a figure on the side of the road. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. The fog was so thick that it was hard to make out anything clearly. But as she drew closer, she saw that it was a man, standing still, his arm outstretched with his thumb raised. He was asking for a ride. Lena's heart raced as she slowed the car. The man was wearing a long, dark coat, and his face was obscured by the shadows cast by the thick trees. Something about him made her uneasy, but the thought of leaving someone stranded in such a desolate place felt wrong. She hesitated, but then decided to stop. After all, she reasoned, it might be safer to have someone with her in these isolated mountains than to continue alone. The man opened the door and slid into the passenger seat without a word. Lena noticed his hands were unusually pale and cold as he shut the door. "Where are you headed?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The man turned to face her, his expression hidden beneath the brim of his hat. "Just keep driving," he replied, his voice low and gravelly. The fear that had been gnawing at her stomach suddenly became a gnawing sense of dread. The car moved slowly through the fog, the headlights barely cutting through the dense mist. Lena tried to focus on the road ahead, but her mind kept drifting to the man sitting next to her. His presence was unsettling. He hadn't spoken another word since he got into the car, and the silence was suffocating. She glanced over at him, trying to get a better look at his face, but the shadows seemed to cling to him, making it impossible to see his features clearly. His hat was pulled low over his brow, and his coat collar was turned up, obscuring his mouth. The only thing she could see were his eyes, dark, cold, and unnervingly still. Lena attempted to break the silence, hoping to ease the tension. "So, where are you from?" she asked, forcing a smile. The man didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. She tried again, asking him about his destination, but he remained silent, his hands resting motionless on his lap. A shiver ran down Lena's spine as she realized she couldn't hear him breathing. The only sound in the car was the steady thrum of the engine and the tires crunching over the gravel road. The man seemed almost lifeless, as if he were merely a shadow sitting beside her. The road twisted and turned through the mountains, the fog growing thicker with each passing mile. Lena's nerves were on edge, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to ask the man to leave, to tell him she had changed her mind, but the words caught in her throat. Something about him, something intangible and terrifying, kept her from speaking. As they rounded a particularly sharp bend, the man suddenly turned to face her. His eyes bore into hers, sending a wave of cold terror through her body. "You shouldn't have picked me up," he said, his voice a chilling whisper. Before Lena could react, the car jerked violently, as if something had struck it from behind. She screamed, gripping the steering wheel as the car swerved off the road and plunged into the darkness of the forest. The car crashed through the underbrush, the tires skidding on the wet ground as it careened down a steep embankment. Branches snapped and whipped against the windows, the sound of shattering glass filling the air. Lena fought to regain control, but the car was moving too fast, and the terrain was too treacherous. She could hear the man's voice, cold and detached, repeating the same phrase over and over, "You shouldn't have picked me up." With a final jolt, the car came to a halt at the bottom of the hill, wedged between two massive trees. The engine sputtered and died, leaving Lena in utter silence. Her hands were shaking, and her breath came in short, panicked gasps. She turned to check on the man, but he was gone. The passenger seat was empty, the door slightly ajar. Lena's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. She fumbled for her phone, but there was no signal. She was trapped in the middle of nowhere, with no way to call for help and no idea where the man had gone. The air inside the car was stifling, thick with the scent of pine and earth. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She was completely alone, stranded in the forest with a stranger who had vanished without a trace. She had no choice but to leave the car and find help. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to stay inside, to lock the doors and wait until morning, but she knew that wasn't an option. The man was out there somewhere, and she had to find a way back to the road before it was too late. Lena stepped out of the car, her legs trembling beneath her. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. The fog clung to the trees like a shroud, making it difficult to see more than a few feet in any direction. She tried to calm herself, but the fear gnawed at her, growing stronger with every step she took. As she moved through the dense underbrush, the feeling of being watched grew more intense. She couldn't shake the sensation that the man was nearby, hidden in the shadows, waiting for her to let her guard down. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees towering overhead like ancient sentinels. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she realized she was not alone. Something was out there, stalking her through the darkness. Lena quickened her pace, the fear driving her forward despite the darkness and the uneven ground. The sound of her footsteps seemed to echo through the forest, the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot reverberating in the oppressive silence. She couldn't tell how far she had gone or which direction she was heading. All she knew was that she had to keep moving. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, almost suffocating. She could hear faint rustling sounds behind her, the crack of a branch breaking, the whisper of something moving through the fog. It was as if the very forest was alive, conspiring against her, pushing her further into its depths. Panic surged through Lena as she stumbled over a root, nearly falling to the ground. She caught herself just in time, but the noise she made seemed to provoke whatever was following her. The rustling grew louder, closer, as if the thing, whatever it was, had been waiting for her to make a mistake. She broke into a run, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she pushed through the underbrush. The fog wrapped around her like a cold, damp blanket, obscuring her vision and making it impossible to see where she was going. Branches scratched at her arms and face, but she barely felt the pain. Her only thought was to get away, to escape the unseen terror that was hunting her. As she ran, the sound of footsteps behind her grew louder, more insistent. She risked a glance over her shoulder, but the fog was too thick to see anything clearly. All she could make out was a dark shape moving through the trees, a shadow that seemed to blend with the night itself. Lena's fear reached a fever pitch as she realized she couldn't outrun it. The thing was faster, stronger, and it knew the forest far better than she did. She could hear its breathing now, a low, guttural rasp that sent shivers down her spine. It was close, so close that she could feel its presence looming behind her, its cold breath on the back of her neck. Desperation took hold as she realized there was no escape. She was trapped, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. Lena's legs burned with exhaustion, her lungs screaming for air as she pushed herself to keep running. But deep down, she knew it was hopeless. The thing was closing in on her, its presence growing stronger with each passing second. She could hear it now, clearly, the heavy footfalls echoing in the dark, the sound of something wet and slick dragging across the ground. Her mind raced, searching for any possible way out, but every option seemed impossible. The forest was a labyrinth of twisted trees and dense fog, and she had no idea which way led back to the road. She was completely lost, disoriented, and terrified. Suddenly, the ground beneath her gave way, and she stumbled into a small clearing. The fog was thinner here, allowing the pale light of the moon to filter through the trees. But there was no comfort in the moonlight, only the chilling realization that she was trapped. The thing stepped into the clearing behind her, its form finally visible in the dim light. Lena's heart nearly stopped as she saw it clearly for the first time. The man, the hitchhiker, stood before her, but he was no longer human. His face was twisted and grotesque, the skin pulled tight over his bones, his eyes hollow and black. His clothes were soaked in blood, and his hands were twisted into claw-like shapes. He grinned at her, a grotesque parody of a smile that sent a wave of nausea through her. "You shouldn't have picked me up," he rasped, his voice barely recognizable as human. The thing took a step closer, and Lena could see the blood dripping from its mouth, the torn remnants of flesh caught in its teeth. Panic took over, and Lena scrambled backwards, her hands scraping against the rough ground. She could feel the tears streaming down her face, her heart pounding in her chest as the thing advanced on her. It was no longer a question of escape, there was no escape. The thing was here, and it was going to kill her. But as it reached for her, something within Lena snapped. A surge of adrenaline coursed through her veins, and she lashed out, striking the thing with all the strength she had left. The force of the blow caught it off guard, and it stumbled back, giving her a momentary advantage. Lena seized the opportunity, scrambling to her feet and running deeper into the forest, her only thought to put as much distance between herself and the thing as possible. Lena's body screamed in protest as she pushed herself to keep running. Every muscle ached, her breath came in ragged gasps, and her vision blurred from exhaustion. But she couldn't stop. She knew that if she did, the thing would catch her, and she would be lost forever in the darkness. The forest grew thicker, the trees closing in around her like a cage. She could hear the thing crashing through the underbrush behind her, its guttural growls growing louder and more feral. The clearing had bought her some time, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. She had to find a way to stop it, to end the nightmare once and for all. Up ahead, she saw a massive oak tree, its roots twisting up from the ground like gnarled hands. A memory flashed through her mind, something she had read about ancient rituals performed by the villagers in these mountains, rituals meant to protect against dark spirits. It was a long shot, but it was her only hope. Lena skidded to a stop in front of the tree, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know the exact words of the ritual, but she had to try something. Anything. She pressed her hands against the rough bark, closing her eyes and whispering a desperate prayer, asking for protection, for salvation, for an end to the terror. The thing burst into the clearing, its eyes gleaming with malevolent hunger. Lena could feel its presence behind her, the cold breath on her neck, the sharp claws reaching for her. She screamed, pouring all her fear and desperation into the words, begging the ancient spirits of the forest to help her, to stop the thing that was hunting her. For a moment, everything was still. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with anticipation. Then, slowly, the ground beneath the oak tree began to tremble. The roots shifted and twisted, reaching up from the earth like living creatures. The thing hesitated, its eyes flickering with uncertainty as it watched the roots coil and writhe. With a final, desperate plea, Lena called out to the spirits one last time, her voice hoarse and trembling. The roots surged forward, wrapping around the thing's legs, pulling it down towards the earth. The thing shrieked in rage, thrashing wildly, but the roots held fast, dragging it down into the ground. Lena watched in horrified fascination as the thing was swallowed by the earth, its screams growing fainter until they were nothing more than a distant echo. The ground sealed shut, leaving no trace of the thing that had hunted her, no evidence of the nightmare she had endured. The forest was silent once more, the fog lifting as the first light of dawn broke through the trees. Lena collapsed to the ground, her body shaking with exhaustion and relief. She had survived. The thing was gone, and she was free. But as she lay there, gasping for breath, she knew that the memory of this night would haunt her forever. She had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, but the terror, the fear, it would never truly leave her. It would stay with her, a shadow in the back of her mind, a reminder of the thing that had nearly claimed her life. If you enjoy these kinds of spine-chilling stories, then I promise you won't want to miss the latest video I just posted on the channel. Trust me, it'll make you tremble with fear. Head over and check it out, if you dare. And before you go, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below, smash that like button, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. I'm truly grateful that you stayed with me until the end, and if you have your own terrifying tale, feel free to send it to me at the email provided. Who knows? It might just be the next story featured here on the channel. Thanks again for watching, and as always, sweet dreams.